Welcome back, everyone. In the last module, we talked about information architecture. And I brought up a few concepts that are going to be explained a lot further in this module, which is focused on taxonomy and metadata. So what is taxonomy? Taxonomy is the science of categorization or classification of things based on a predetermined system. So in the last module, when I mentioned a term controlled vocabulary, think about that as our predetermined system, a list of accepted attributes within a facet that you can classify that element with, that product or that service, for example. Further to that, taxonomy, if we break it down, the meaning of the word specifically comes from a Latin root, taxus and nomos, which loosely is defined as an order or arrangement along with a law or a science. So it's that order or classification with that law or science, that law being that predetermined system. Taxonomy is the guide for us when we bring in new products, new services into a specific structure. And structure needs taxonomy. It doesn't matter how beautiful your interface is if you can't find anything. And taxonomy allows us to do that. Taxonomy allows for the organization and classification of both content and functionality based on similarities and differences. This helps us to create categories, hierarchies, and metadata tags to facilitate search. I hope some of this is really coming together. We've already spoken about hierarchies. We've spoken about attributes and facets. We've spoken about groupings of elements with specific names, with like intent. Taxonomy really gives us that additional step of organization that helps us make those decisions. Consider a news website. Would a piece on the results of a recent Canadian curling match appear in the US politics section? I'm sure you're saying, of course not. But why not? Why wouldn't it appear there? Think about that for just a second. Now, some of you may be thinking the US politics section would only show a piece of news tagged with the USA. So it obviously wouldn't show up there. Or, the Canadian curling match would be tagged with sports, and sports wouldn't show up in the politics section. And that's really, hopefully you've come to that conclusion. These things aren't related, but if they were just tagged as a news piece with a date, and they happened on the same day, and they weren't differentiated with facets like type of news or region or origin, then you would likely end up with some things in the wrong place. Taxonomy controls that. So let's talk about facets and attributes in a little more detail. A facet is typically an aspect of an item used to facilitate categorization. For example, a top has a style, color, a size, and a brand. Not dissimilar to our example last week with a book on the Indigo website. That book had a title, had an author, had a date. That content type was hopefully defined with that level of detail. And within facets, we find attributes. Attributes are simply the description related to a facet. For example, the top style is a sweater, its color is red, its size is medium, and its brand is Uniqlo, and so on and so forth. We need to really understand that facet to attribute relationship. And if you can grasp that, you'll well be on your way to defining content types and how they work within an information architecture. So why are these things so important? Well, taxonomy and classification is important because we need to make sense of what's around us. without being able to group things together in a formulaic way, it's really difficult to create an experience at the scale of some of our larger consumer packaged goods sites without a really robust taxonomy. We also need to be able to find things. And we can find things if the product or content is tagged in the proper way with the proper vocabulary. Taxonomy is important because it saves time. And taxonomy is important because ultimately it saves everyone money. Taxonomy is everywhere. Everywhere you go, there's grouping of information. Everywhere you go, there's a grouping of information that is done in. There's a grouping of information that's done in some formulaic way. Whether we're browsing down the aisles of a grocery store and seeing things grouped into those aisles in specific sections, or whether we're at a retail store or online searching through something, that taxonomy is what's guiding both of those activities. And within taxonomy, we have something called metadata. So those are those keys to searchability. Metadata provides the structure that we need within our facets and attributes. Metadata is very simply described as data about data. And they're the open list of all of these attributes that are used to describe something. When we look at this, if we look at this element on the screen, what can you tell me about it? Let me start you off. And then I'd like you to pause the video and do the exercise prior to the next, and do the exercise right after this module. It'll ask you to enter as many attributes about this element that you can think of. It'll ask you to enter as many attributes about this element that you can think of. Give me as much data about this data that you know. Let me start you off with a couple ideas to get the ball rolling, but don't hold back. Most students come up with at least 20 to 30 data points about this thing. It's green. It's a fruit. And it's shiny. What else is it? I'll let you fill in the blanks right after this module. Now we see metadata elements in many different places. And this is just a more formulaic approach to facets and attributes. That specific, repeatable process that we see in library sciences. When you think about libraries and historical archives of information, they are the most robust in their use of metadata. I'm sure many of you have stumbled across the library stacks and the old cards that they used to use, or even see this same formulaic approach in the digital renderings of these cards in libraries. These include a formulaic approach to the facets of a specific publication. And you can see how they're broken down here following the Dublin Core metadata element set. If we were to use the Dublin Core metadata elements and describe our thing that I asked you to create an open data list for, we would be grouping the elements like this. Our title would be Granny Smith, our creator would be GBC Farms, our subject would be apples, things that are good in salad, or maybe something different, depending on your interpretation of what this thing was. What are the most important elements of this thing? What are the attributes that stood out? What facets did you decide to list within your metadata structure? Without metadata, searching and filtering would be impossible. When we think about our consumer packaged goods experiences online today, there are thousands and thousands of SKUs in the majority of our retailers. And without a really great structure of information, nothing would be findable. But hierarchies go well beyond what we actually see. Hierarchies, facets, attributes, controlled vocabularies, and metadata go all the way back to the supply chain. We can find the broccoli in a grocery store because we know the common convention is to place it in the produce section. Innately, you can find that element on the far left in the produce section. What it's next to is sometimes different. Also, in a grocery store, you'll find it in the produce section and likely near other vegetables. But in a different type of store or a different environment, would it be placed somewhere else? Now let's turn our attention to the element in the middle. I'm sure a lot of you know that is a steak. And if we were to talk about some of the attributes of that steak, beef would come to mind, meat would be an attribute of that. There's a price attribute, a weight attribute. All of those elements used to describe that steak would qualify where it lives in a specific hierarchy. The easy assumption for us to make there is that that would live within the meat section of our grocery store. But what if you were going to a meat market? Where would that steak be juxtaposed? Is there a beef section within the meat section? Is there a steak section within the beef section within the meat section? Is there a certain quality or level of grade of quality of that meat that groups that in a different place as well? And what if that specific piece of meat is organic or grass-fed versus grain-fed? Does that place it in a different hierarchy or in a different place in a bricks and mortar store? And then think about it conceptually online. How do we group that together with other like items in different context? And lastly, on the far right, our toothpaste. Where would we find the toothpaste product if it were in a grocery store? Or if it were in a pharmacy? Or if it were in a 7-Eleven? Would that change the way that you find this product within a specific hierarchy? Everywhere we go, we see informal hierarchies. On menus of restaurants, we see groupings of elements based on the timeline of your meal. And we see formal ones like library sciences that group specific topics of publications together. When talking about hierarchies and best practices, it's best to use no more than 7 to 10 top-level buckets for your information. So top-level labels in your global nav in the digital space, or top-level elements in your physical environment. The human brain is conditioned to remember a certain amount of things, and more than that tends to push your mind into information overload. So it's best to settle in something in that. And you know what? Less is more. If you can get your specific hierarchy into less than 7 categories, then by all means, please do it. And it's also a best practice to not use more than 3 to 7 layers in your hierarchy. So don't go any deeper than 7 when you dig down. And I'd almost say that any deeper than 4 or 5 tends to get really confusing for most users. It's really when you get into really deep and complex hierarchies that you have to dig anywhere past 4 or 5 levels. Whatever way you slice and dice it from a breadth and depth perspective, it's important to simply be balanced. Don't get too wide or too deep. If you can balance things out and spread them out in a more concise way, then you'll create repeatable patterns that users will get used to. And that's extremely important when creating a great experience online. And no matter what the breadth and depth or balance is of your hierarchy, it's even more important to keep it intuitive. Users should be able to predict which bucket will hold the content they're seeking. I wouldn't expect to find that steak from the previous example in the produce section. And I wouldn't expect to see that toothpaste in the home cleaning products. Make sure you create those expectations and base them on user intuition. Make sure that it's unambiguous. Clarity should be your driving force when you create a user experience, and it's no different in creating a taxonomy and a hierarchy. There should be one and only one obvious place to put something. Now that doesn't mean you're not going to put it somewhere else, but make sure that it's at least in the most obvious place that the majority of users would expect to find it. Make sure that it can easily accommodate new items, new terms into the taxonomy, and new groupings of products. Don't start it too shallow and don't create it too deep. Create it for what's to come in a specific amount of time. Say 12 to 18 months would be a good one for the internet. And finally, make it relevant. The taxonomy, your hierarchy should reflect users' perspectives. They should be able to experience things in a similar way that they just did on another experience. Don't reinvent the wheel if something has been done right before. Going back to our Granny Smith, here's an example of a hierarchy that we could utilize to find that product. What hierarchy would we use to find this product? Would it be the same as the Granny Smith? Or would it be different? And I think that's the debate. Is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Should it be beside cucumbers or apples? Is your user a regular consumer or a scientist? And is this product found on a botany website or on a grocery website? That will change the way that your hierarchy is developed and the way that your attributes guide that hierarchy and the positioning of elements. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to taxonomy, and we'll see you in the next module.